Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Encyclopedia Hermetica, A Big History, Part 32. Today we're going to do things a little differently, and I'm going to give you all a more practical lesson today. This will be on our third part of the trivium, rhetoric, that is, the art of speaking well and convincingly. This is a very heady topic with all manner of technical jargon which comes down to us from antiquity, and as such I will label this talk as another one of our quote-unquote seminars, just like my talk about the trivium, as opposed to another purely historical talk. This lecture has far more practical applications than just mere intellectual stimulation, and so you may need to pay extra careful attention and possibly even take notes. What I want out of this talk is not that you go away with a handful of fancy jargon or technical labels, though if you can internalize these, you'll be better off for it. No, what I want is that you begin to use these tools to critically analyze the speech of those around you. Politicians, news anchors, the management at work, self-help gurus, religious leaders, university professors, conspiracy theorists, activists, or whatever. I'm not doing this to make you cynical, but I'm definitely doing it to make you more skeptical, which to some is a bad thing, but to me it's the key that unlocks free thought. It seems that in this day and age we tend to use skepticism and cynicism interchangeably. You need not become a cynic. It just so happens that skepticism leads that way much of the time. What you do need to begin doing is to start thinking with a blank slate, or at least as blank a slate as possible, in order to think clearly and rationally. We are born from silence, but definitely not born into silence. It's all too easy to get bogged down by that pesky voice inside your head, that voice which we often confuse as being our quote-unquote selves. In reality, however, this voice isn't you, or God, or anything like that. This voice is entirely the collection of imprints you've accumulated over the course of your life. It is the sum total of everything you've ever heard, truth and lies all thrown in without distinction. That voice in your head is the voice of everyone around you. And when it arises in that subjective field we call consciousness, you need to be able to dissect it, take it apart, lay it out, and observe it with some degree of feigned objectivity. If you don't develop the skills to do this, you'll be just like an absent-minded scientist working in a sterile laboratory, who drags in all sorts of exogenous microorganisms and then wonders why all of his samples are contaminated with this unusual specimen from another environment. When we talk about the truth, between quotation marks, we need to ask ourselves, the truth about what? And then work from there. The trivium, with rhetoric as the last but not least of its components, is a sort of decontamination chamber for your mind. The blanker your slate, or the cleaner your body, to keep the metaphor going, the less likely that you are to let a few rapidly reproducing foreign microorganisms to flood the petri dish that is your mind. Like lockpicking, ceremonial magic, or martial arts, rhetoric is a skill, morally neutral through and through. In the same way we've broken down logic into manageable categories to some extent, rhetoric can also be broken down into categories, which is one of the favorite pastimes of the linguistically infected man. Here are our 4 subcategories of rhetoric. Think of each of these as a heartstring. A good rhetorician pulls on all of these and doesn't put one before the others. They're like the 4 humors of good rhetoric. First, we have logos, reason, and this comprises the use of logical ideas to appeal to an audience's own reason. If I'm reasonable, and I speak reasonably, and you are reasonable, chances are we'll do just fine sharing information. The next is pathos, and this is an appeal to the audience's emotions. This, in large part, is what people call acting. You're coaxing emotions out of people who may or may not have come to see you for that reason. Tone, facial expression, hand gestures, emphasis, all these and more contribute to the pathos of a given speech. The next is ethos, and it's all about the appeal to the guiding tenets that characterize a community or ideology, whether religious, political, nationalistic, or what have you. This can also take the form as an appeal to the author's credibility. It's an appeal based on the character of the speaker more so than the general circumstances. Lastly, we have kairos, which is Greek for the right time or timeliness. And it's an appeal to the right place at the right timeness of the argument. This one is a bit harder to put a finger on since it's so circumstantial, but it's definitely as important as any of the other three rhetorical humors or heartstrings. So it's time for us to get into some nitty-gritty details to get an actual coherent idea of how one might analyze rhetoric. The following list, with some of its examples, was drawn from the Dutch classicist Anton de Leeman's Orationis Ratio, which in turn was based off the Rhetorica ad Herenium, a rhetorical handbook written in the 1st century BC. Now, let's also remember that rhetorical handbooks like these are in the vein of a much older Greek tradition, from guys like Demosthenes, and that's the reason all these technical words are in Greek. Inasmuch as the Latins were concerned with good rhetoric and oratory, they got their love from the Greeks at quite an early age. Rhetoric flourished as a science in so-called democracies and republics because these systems of governance are all about persuading others for votes in your favor. Though persuasion is obviously not unique to the Western world, the Greeks and Romans were definitely the cultures responsible for establishing the canons of style that we find tasteful today. What dictated good style back then is still what dictates good style now. Our rhetorical DNA, what we naturally find convincing, euphonic, or whatever, all of this comes down to us from these great ancient rhetoricians. Now, I'm obviously not going to cover all the figures of rhetoric, given that there are well over 200, and it would be extremely tedious for both of us to go through the catalog. But hopefully this can ignite some interest into this subject, which has long been thought to be only relevant to Ivy League debate teams or political propagandists, media outlets, and marketing teams. So without further ado, here's our meat and potatoes. See if you can think up some of your own examples as we go along, whether from your favorite songs or presidential addresses or TED Talks, sermons, university lectures, pre-epic battle Hollywood speeches, or whatever. This should help you solidify these concepts and anchor them into your own reality. As I always like to say, the way out is through. Always try to employ these rhetorical strategies, and if you do, you'll manage to catch on when people around you are using them too. So if you ever watch a particularly persuasive commercial or political address, before you run out and buy that product or give your support to that specific talking head, run these lists through your head and see if someone really is giving you an honest picture or if they're serving you up a polished turd. In the same way that pearls trod upon by swine are still pearls, turds polished to a shine are still turds. Don't let fancy words blind you to someone else's bullshit. Alright, so number 1, Anaphora. This is one of the most common devices in speech making and good poetry. Anaphora in Greek literally means a carrying back, from ana, up, and phero, to carry. What it is when a word is repeated at the beginning, middle, or end of a series of clauses or sentences. This creates a sort of parallelism and rhythm which can intensify the meaning of the piece. Repetition also makes things easy to remember, so if you're some slimy politician and you'd like to persuade the masses, you might want to employ this tactic at a public address. Generally, it's used to appeal to the audience's emotions so as to persuade, inspire, and motivate them. Here's some examples. Shakespeare's "Mad world, mad kings, mad composition" is a good short example. Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech uses the line "I have a dream" 8 times, and that makes it the textbook example for a good use of anaphora. A good example from a poem I've read here before is taken from William Blake's London. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear. So note this in every repetition. Okay, our next device is climax. This is the repetition of words that works like climbing steps. That's what climax literally means in Greek, ladder. Climax is often used in persuasion, predominantly in advertising, to create false dichotomies and then to focus attention upon the side which they want you to err on. A good example comes from the letters of St. Paul to the Corinthians. There are 3 things that will endure: faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. Another climax can be found in these words from the American Declaration of Independence. They are endowed by their creators with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So, hopefully you can see how the initial inferior options, so faith and hope, or life and liberty, make the final terms, love, or the pursuit of happiness, seem better by comparison than they might appear in isolation. X is good, Y is better, Z is the best is a standard format, hence this latter concept. It's a figure of rhetoric concerned with slipping in value judgments which generally are arbitrarily those of the speaker. This tactic can also be used in reverse to make the list go down the ladder, such as an initial term seems better by comparison. So A isn't perfect, but B is worse and C is worst. So that's climax. Keep an eye and an ear out for this, because what it's doing is subconsciously slipping in value judgments for you, and that's something to be aware of, albeit not intrinsically hostile towards. Antithesis. So, antithesis, in short, is a pair of comparisons. Si la jeunesse savait, si la vieillesse pouvait. If only the youth knew, if only the elderly could. This is done to achieve some contrast. One small step for a man, but a giant step for mankind. Speech is silver, but silence is gold. Money is the root of all evil. Poverty is the fruit of all goodness, and so on and so forth. Again, as in climax, we can be led, though not necessarily, to value judgments through antitheses which we may not share, so watch for this pitfall. False dichotomies, or false dilemmas, are one of the most common problems in the use of antitheses, and if you know anything about my work, you'll find that I love collapsing false dichotomies wherever I find them, though obviously I'm not immune to producing them myself. White implies black, wealth implies poverty, good implies evil, and so forth. We've got to be more Taoist in our thinking and get ourselves out of potential pitfalls. The world is holographic. You cut a piece out of it and you can see how every other part of the world is implied by that little piece. Try it as an intellectual exercise sometime. Pick an object and make a mental list of all the things that object implies. Then, all the things which those implications do not imply. And then once you've done this thoroughly enough, you've actually created a map of the entire universe. In any case, I digress. I'll give one more great example of this climax device by one of history's greatest hypocrites, Richard Nixon, who said at his inaugural address, "We find ourselves rich in goods but ragged in spirit, reaching with magnificent precision for the moon, but falling into raucous discord on earth. We are caught in war, wanting peace. We are torn by division, wanting unity." See if you can poke some holes into this without taking into consideration whose venomous mouth these lines come from. You'll see it's fairly easy. But anyhow, moving on. Parison. Okay, so this one arises when two clauses in a sentence line up if we were to stack them one on top of the other. Obviously, this is much easier to see when you have the sentences written out in front of you, but a good example is the sentence I just used. Si la jeunesse savait, si la vieillesse pouvait. If only the youth knew, if only the elderly could. A more simple example you might recognize is from Dickens. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Now, there's nothing terribly manipulative here. All a parison does is ensure that the sentence is balanced and not skewed toward one clause or another. It's a sort of application of Pythagorean proportion and balance to a sentence. This makes things catchy or hook-like, making them easy to remember. It's great for headlines. So, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. Melts in your mouth, not in your hand. And lastly, to use the words of a slightly less evil man than Nixon, let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty. Now, an isocolon is a lot like this. It's a similar idea, but it necessitates that parallel clauses have the exact same number of syllables. It's like a tighter parison. Some examples I've just given are isocolonic. Now, there are a few examples on my list, like the homoioptoton and the homoioteleton, which are only relevant to Greek, Latin, or other inflected languages. That is, languages with cases. English doesn't really have these, except in archaicisms like thou, thy, thine, etc. So I'll just pass over this very briefly. It's when you string together words with the same case endings. O fortunatam natam me consule Romam. So, O fortunate date, for the Roman state was the date of my great consulate. But again, this translation is but an attempt to give that sense, and not an exact approximation of what's going on more concisely in the Latin. Alright, so next we have alliteration, which surprisingly enough wasn't in these old rhetorical handbooks. This was actually a stylistic error, best avoided. But for one reason or another, the Romans loved it, and they passed that love down onto us. It's for this very reason that the word itself, alliteration, comes from a Latin word and not a Greek word. An example in Latin would be otite tutte tati tibitanta tyrane tulisti. I don't think I need to explain this terribly much, given that every high school student of English learns about alliteration in their poetry units. It's a stylistic device in which a number of words with the same first consonant sound occur close together in a series. But here, let me give you a few more examples so that you can get a sense of how powerful alliteration is. Dunkin' Donuts, PayPal, Best Buy, Coca-Cola, American Apparel, Chuck E. Cheese's, Bed Bath & Beyond, Krispy Kreme, Lululemon, TED Talks, Weight Watchers, Blackberries, Tetley Teas, Tater Tots, Tonka Toys, Kit Kat, Tic Tac. So, you see how prevalent and effective this type of word sorcery is? Not bad when we consider that this was a faux pas over 2 millennia ago. Nowadays, it seems to be the sine qua non of branding. Okay, so moving on. Next, we have your dad's favorite figure of rhetoric, paronomasia, which is a nice and complicated sounding word for wordplay or puns, though not necessarily meant to be funny. So, for example, a little more than kin and a little less than kind. Atheism is a non-profit institution. This breakfast is excellent, and so forth. I'm sure you can think of all sorts of puns off the top of your head, and if you can't, go ask your dad. Puns have a long history in human writing, and Sumerian cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphs were actually originally based on complex systems of punning. For this reason, punning has been credited by some as fundamental to all alphabets, all writing, and even human civilization as a whole. Civilization itself is the greatest pun in history, meaning everything except itself. If you ever hear Terence McKenna give a good explanation of what he means by visual language, he tries to stress how it consists of a sort of four-dimensional pun, which is visual, linguistic, holographic, and reveals nothing but pure intention. So, perhaps if puns created language and civilization, puns will also save us from their limitations once we've learned to properly employ them. Now, there's a sort of special pun called the figura etymologica, and it's really my favorite kind of paronomasia. This is a pun based on etymology, which makes it extremely subtle and usually only funny or even noticeable to linguists, classicists, etymologists, and so forth. It's a kind of cross-linguistic pun. It spans over more than one language, and in order to catch it, the listener must understand both languages and how they're historically connected. And again, not all puns are meant to be funny. An example of a figura etymologica can be found in Romans 1:25. Who changed the truth of God into a lie and worshipped and served the creature more than the creator. So both creature and creator stem from the same word. Another by Tennyson might be, there hath he lain for ages and will lie. So both lain and lie come from the same verb. A more subtle figura etymologica might be something like this, and I've taken this from the lyrics of the Polish death metal band Behemoth's Blow Your Trumpets, Gabriel, wherein it said, root of David, eradicate. In English, eradicate simply means to destroy, but in Latin, it means to uproot, from the Latin radix, root. So, in English, to eradicate a root is an etymological pun. Given the fact that the composer Adam Darsky has an MA in classics, it would surprise me that this was not intentional. Anyhow, moving on. The next figure of rhetoric on my list is the Polyptoton, which might best be rendered as a variety of choices. This, again, is more relevant to ancient languages than it is to modern non-inflected ones, since it's a play on case use. In Latin, an example might be vim vi repellere licet. It is lawful or permitted to repel force, vim, with force, vi, a sentiment that I certainly agree with. An English example of a Polyptoton is something like a man's man, using man twice, once in the nominative, once in the genitive. Another example would be, in the morning when the morning bird sings. It isn't really a very strong device in English, but it's certainly one to keep an ear out for. Just because something sounds catchy or jingly doesn't mean it's true. People often let their guards down in the presence of pretty words and catchy slogans, And that's exactly what I'm trying to get everybody to avoid. Alright, next up, we've got the zeugma. Zeugma is a Greek word for yoke, as in the thing you put on oxen. And it might interest you to know that this word is etymologically related with yoga and Sanskrit, and the Latin verb iungo, to join. This is basically a strategy for being pithy and concise, since it involves using one verb for many different ideas in a sentence. Tennyson's Ulysses has, "He works his work, I mine." So, to point out the obvious, you're supposed to resupply the verb work in your head. He works his work, I work mine. From the point of a prescriptive grammarian, and really who cares what these dinosaurs have to say, this is ungrammatical since I work and he works are separate conjugations. It's not I works. But anyhow, this is nitpicking. A more specific use of this technique is called solipsis, and it pertains to ironic or amusing zeugmas. So, for example, at that moment, would the maiden stain her honor or her dress? Here, a stain on one's honor is figurative, whereas the other kind of stain is quite literal. It's just fun to apply the twofold meaning of the word stain. Another good example is from Commander Riker. You are free to execute your laws and your citizens as you see fit. So obviously, executing laws and executing people are two totally different kinds of execution. But this kind of fun ambiguity is what makes for great rhetoric. Perfection is not achieved when there's nothing left to add. It's achieved when there's nothing left to take away. And zeugmas and solipses are great for this very reason. Next up, we have anadiplosis. And this is the repetition of the same word twice, especially to evoke a feeling of grief or seriousness. Lies, lies, I can't believe a word you say. Or rage, rage against the dying of the light. I suppose it's a more specific kind of anaphora, but the effect is similar. This is a favorite of public speakers who want to pull on your heartstrings. I don't know what it is, but there's something about anadiplosis that is very convincing, and really, all you have to do is repeat a word twice. Another example of an anadiplosis is when a sentence ends in a word, and then the sentence after it picks up with the same word. So, for example, Yoda's fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. Or St. Paul's, we rejoice in suffering because we know that suffering produces perseverance, and perseverance, character, and character, hope, and hope does not disappoint us. That's Romans 5:3-5. It's a real favorite of preachers. No redemption except through the blood of Jesus. Plant that seed and put the dollar in the basket. I think you get the point. So let's move on to synonymia, from the Greek syn, together, and onoma, name, which is a sort of stylized tautology. It's the repetition of one idea with different words which adds emotional force or intellectual clarity. So, for example, in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, the plebs are reproached with several different pejorative names. You blocks, you stones, you worse than senseless things. Another example is, that's worthless, useless, and of no value. So yeah, it's an emphatic tautology. Next up we have an anti-metaboly. This is a personal favorite of mine, and this is when you switch around an idea and it works both ways. In the last lecture I gave, I said, everything is in your head, and your head is in everything. The Emerald Tablet has, that which is above is just as that which is below, and that which is below is just as that which is above. A good classical example of this would be, esse oportet ut vivas, non vivere ut edas. You should eat to live, not live to eat. Temesis is next up on the list, and this is what you get when someone says, unfucking believable. Temesis comes from the Greek word to cut, and it arises when you cut a word into two parts and stick a new word in between. A popular usage of temesis is a whole other, which requires cutting up another to provide emphasis. Next, we have praeteritio, which politicians are notorious for doing. This is when you end up emphasizing something by pretending to leave it out. I'm not going to say anything about Mr. Ford's crack problem, but his public policy is downright mad. Or, far be it from me to tell you how much of a fool you were being yesterday. Or, I'm not one for gossip, but did you see that slutty dress Amber was wearing to the wedding? It's this sort of thing. It's very disingenuous, and it should set off as many red flags in your mind as, I'm not racist, but... Alright, so next we have metaphor, allegory, and irony. You know all these, so I won't mention them. See what I did there? Onomatopoeia. This is not just words that imitate sounds like boom, kablam, and pow. It's just any made-up word, like supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. I make up words and use made-up words all the time if I feel that the sense is clear. Don't hesitate to use them, just be aware when made-up words are being liberally thrown around in public discourse. Why couldn't that person use a word that already exists? Are they too stupid to know those words? Are they masking what they actually mean with ambiguity because they don't actually know what they're talking about? These are the kinds of questions which may come to mind, in addition to less suspicious questions like, is that word just an import from another language I don't speak? So I'll just go through the last of these quickly. Metonymy is calling a thing by a word associated with that thing, so my ride for my car. Synecdoche is calling a thing by a word which only denotes part of it, so my wheels for my car. Calling a girl toots or sugar lips, not recommended, that sort of thing. Antonomasia is calling a person by a phrase that says something about them. The blind bard for Homer, the philosopher for Aristotle, the man of many pains for Odysseus, der Führer for Hitler, and so on. Lastly, we have hyperbole, which is a fancy way of saying exaggeration. The Greek word means something like throwing above and beyond, and I doubt you need any examples for that. Just be aware that there's all sorts of people who use hyperbole in contexts where it's totally inappropriate, like in newscasting or political debates. People will seldom call you out on it, and that's actually quite sad, because the number one problem we face is that the words we use most often don't reflect the reality around us. We get lost in these maps, and then we base our lives on grossly over-exaggerated or grossly under-exaggerated, rhetorical information. Not good, to say the least. So that about does it for figures of speech. Like I said, there are far more than just these, but this gives you an idea of what the science of rhetoric actually entails. I just pray that I'm not boring you to death, because some of this is rather dry. I promise you, however, that however dry rhetoric is, it can be that much more useful to you. Now, before moving on to my conclusion, I want to quickly go over some figures of thought, most of which you already know. Among these, we have tropes. It has literary, or I guess media stereotypes. I'm sure you can think of thousands of these. These are most often used by people who have no idea what they're talking about on any given subject, since they had to resort to epistemological cartoons instead of concrete information or data. Another one of these figures of thought is things like emphasis, making a strong impression by markedly leaving something out. This is how a damnatio memoriae often backfires and does the inverse of what it's meant to do. In something like a Cicero speech, we'd get him referring to Catiline as iste, a pejorative form of that man, instead of using the guy's actual name. Well, what is it about this guy that's so unspeakable? Now I want to know. Anybody named he who will not be named is bound to attract some attention. So yeah, that's what emphasis actually means in terms of figures of thought, as opposed to its sense as verbal stress. Okay, quickly we have energeia, making a strong impression with a vivid description. I think ekphrases fall into this category. These are detailed literary descriptions of objects like Achilles' shield. We have ethopeia, which is the painting of a word picture for someone. We have the slightly more advanced version of ethopeia, which is actually quite common in courtrooms, and that's prosopopeia, which is like painting a word picture of a person, but then pretending to actually have a conversation with this made-up entity. When this happens, you can guarantee someone is setting up a straw man to burn down. We only know our own ideas about other people's ideas, so be cautious of anyone who you suspect isn't aware of that great schism between all of us. Last but not least, we have exemplum, which is when you bring up an example of a famous person's famous moments. So, George Washington cutting down a cherry tree, or Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon, or whatever. It's a moral anecdote, real or fictitious, which is used to drive home a point. More often than not, it's building castles in the sky, however, so beware of those who use exempla at the drop of a hat, because they're often red herrings, or they're totally irrelevant outside of the original context. Hang out with any hardcore fundamentalists for any length of time, and you'll see how easy it is for them to apply biblical exempla out of context to situations which really have nothing in common with the given stories. I don't want to write off this exempla thing entirely, just be aware of their often all too facile usage. So, I suppose you're wondering why I've decided to go through all this with you, and I suppose you've also realized it isn't to improve your poetry or your business presentations. Now, the reason is this. I've noticed that recently, and this really is recently, given that it's contingent on the existence of the internet, but I've noticed that politics and media have become increasingly inseparable from one another. Politics have always been rhetorically oriented. This is what made the sophists so popular in ancient Athens. The truth didn't matter. All that mattered was convincing people to act according to your will. It's this issue which prompted Plato's philosophical campaign against guys like Protagoras and Gorgias. Slick rhetoric has always been and will always be the sine qua non of politics. But today there's far more subtle trickery afoot than there ever has been. And on the flip side, there's also far more information available to people, were they not all trapped in artificial echo chambers. You would think that with all the information available to people, they should be able to make clear-headed and impartial decisions, but unfortunately that's just not the case. Nowadays, political campaigning has become a sort of all-out multimedia assault, replete with music, film, art, and so forth. There's heartstrings being pulled at every corner. It's inescapable. For the undiscerning eye, it's business as usual, but that's hardly the case. The problem is that so many people are so desensitized to human subtlety and critical thinking from having most of their lives produced for and beamed in through a telescreen. This degree of removal between those broadcasting information and those receiving it widens and widens every year, and as a result, people get more and more gullible. I assume this has some sort of evolutionary reasons behind it. Perhaps people feel safer at home than in public and thus are more receptive to ideas. Perhaps we perceive that getting screwed over by a man on TV can really only screw us up so bad, as opposed to someone in our faces. I really don't know. But propaganda is everywhere you look, not just on the radio and in the newspapers, sources which back in the day were easily avoided. PR or marketing groups are getting better and better at getting in your face. Nowadays, you can hardly go anywhere in a populated area without being bombarded by bullshit. You're too poor, you're too ugly, you're too fat, you're too stupid, you're too lazy, you're not patriotic enough, your partner will leave you for someone better, you will suffer, you will get robbed, you will get infected, and you will die an agonizing death, and so on and so forth. What makes it bullshit is that it stifles the imagination. It puts us in a mode of fear. It drives us like herds of sheep into rigid, artificial categories, which are ultimately two sides of the same coin. It tells us what to feel is important, and obviously it's not a game based on statistics. It's a game of fear. This game of fear manipulates and controls the discourse, the set of words which we are allowed and not allowed to use. Now, faced with this, we have two options, both of which are valid, only one of which is realistic for most people. These are, 1, unplug and retreat into the wilderness, and 2, hone your critical thinking skills. No amount of brainwashing propaganda in the world should be able to rattle a critical thinker. If someone tells a critical thinker a lie 1,000 times, it remains a lie. The person who thought otherwise was not a critical thinker. Now, in order to be a so-called critical thinker, you need to have some categories with which to criticize. And this is why I say the way out is through. If you don't have a decent grasp of what good rhetoric is, then how would you know you've been conned by someone purely through glittering generalities and buzzwords? How would you know the difference between an actually deep and provocative paper versus a word salad of academic or political buzzwords? In academia, so many things said in 10,000 words can be said in 10 words, and in politics, so many things said in 10 words should be said in 10,000. There's only one cure to this problem, and that is what I've discussed earlier in Lecture 21. The trivium. Grammar, logic, and rhetoric. You have to know what it is people are saying, what the words they're using actually mean. That's grammar. Then you have to know if what they mean is actually internally consistent and makes sense. That's logic. Then lastly, and the most relevant to today's lecture, you have to make sure you're not just being dazzled by old formulas which have fooled people into going off to war, giving up their rights, or even forfeiting their souls, purely on account of someone else's smooth-talking. That's rhetoric. What better way to fight a con man than to know the con? What better way to win a fight than to know how to fight? To fight propaganda, we must make propaganda. To fight bad art, we must make good art. And I'm sorry to tell you, but when it comes to aesthetics, there are rules. You're not going to build a building more beautiful than the Pantheon without using the Vitruvian canons of architecture. You're not going to write a fugue more beautifully than Bach if you don't know the rules of what makes a fugue. You could, of course, go off and play your own game, but then you always risk falling into extreme individualism, and therefore solipsism. If you want to give a lecture in purely glossolalia, knock yourself out, but don't expect to make any changes in the world with it. If you want to shit on a canvas and call it art, that's fine too, but don't be surprised when nobody wants it on their wall. You can make your town look like something out of a Dr. Seuss book, but don't expect anyone to take care of it for centuries to come. You must learn the underlying principles. I'm not saying you can't break the rules, but if you don't know the rules before you break them, you're already lost. The way out is through. This has been part 32 of Encyclopedia Hermetica, A Big History, and as always, I'd like to thank you for joining me. I'm Anaphora.
Say what has never been said, to see what has never been seen, to draw, paint, sing, sculpt, dance, and act what has never before been done, to push the envelope of creativity and language. And what's really important is, I call it the felt presence of direct experience, which is a fancy term which just simply means we have to stop consuming our culture. We have to create culture. Don't watch TV. Don't read magazines. Don't even listen to NPR. Create your own road show. The nexus of space and time where you are now is the most immediate sector of your universe. And if you're worrying about Michael Jackson or Bill Clinton or somebody else, then you are disempowered. You're giving it all away to icons. Icons which are maintained by an electronic media, so that you want to dress like X or have lips like Y or something. This is shit-brained, this kind of thinking. That is all cultural diversion. And what is real is you and your friends and your associations, your highs, your orgasms, your hopes, your plans, your fears. And we're told, no, we're unimportant, we're peripheral, get a degree, get a job, get a this, get a that, and then you're a player. You don't even want to play in that game. You want to reclaim your mind and get it out of the hands of the cultural engineers who want to turn you into a half-baked moron consuming all this trash that's being manufactured out of the bones of a dying world. Where is that at?
Fellow citizens, as we gather tonight, our nation is at war, our economy is in recession, and the civilized world faces unprecedented dangers. Yet the state of our union has never been stronger. We last met in an hour of shock and suffering. In 4 short months, our nation has comforted the victims, begun to rebuild New York and the Pentagon, rallied a great coalition, captured, arrested, and rid the world of thousands of terrorists, destroyed Afghanistan's terrorist training camps, saved the people from starvation, and freed a country from brutal oppression. The American flag flies again over our embassy in Kabul. Terrorists who once occupied Afghanistan now occupy cells at Guantanamo Bay. And terrorist leaders who urged followers to sacrifice their lives are running for their own. When I called our troops into action, I did so with complete confidence in their courage and skill. And tonight, thanks to them, we are winning the war on terror. The men and women of our armed forces have delivered a message now clear to every enemy of the United States, even 7,000 miles away, across oceans and continents, on mountaintops and in caves. You will not escape the justice of this nation. For many Americans, these 4 months have brought sorrow and pain that will never completely go away. Every day, a retired firefighter returns to ground zero to feel closer to his 2 sons who died there. At a memorial in New York, a little boy left his football with a note for his lost father. Dear Daddy, please take this to heaven. I don't want to play football until I can play with you again someday. Last month at the grave of her husband, Michael, a CIA officer and Marine who died in Mazar-e-Sharif, Shannon Spann said these words of farewell. Semper Fi, my love. Shannon is with us tonight. Shannon, I assure you and all who have lost a loved one that our cause is just and our country will never forget the debt we owe Michael and all who gave their lives for freedom. Our cause is just, and it continues. Our discoveries in Afghanistan confirmed our worst fears and showed us the true scope of the task ahead. We have seen the depth of our enemies' hatred in videos where they laugh about the loss of innocent life. But some governments will be timid in the face of terror. And make no mistake about it, if they do not act, America will. Our second goal is to prevent regimes that sponsor terror from threatening America or our friends and allies with weapons of mass destruction. Some of these regimes have been pretty quiet since September the 11th, but we know their true nature. North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens. Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror, while an unelected few repress the Iranian people's hope for freedom. Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons for over a decade. This is a regime that has already used poison gas to murder thousands of its own citizens, leaving the bodies of mothers huddled over their dead children. This is a regime that agreed to international inspections, then kicked out the inspectors. This is a regime that has something to hide from the civilized world. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world. By seeking weapons of mass destruction, these regimes pose a grave and growing danger. They could provide these arms to terrorists, giving them the means to match their hatred. They could attack our allies or attempt to blackmail the United States. In any of these cases, the price of indifference would be catastrophic. We will work closely with our coalition to deny terrorists and their state sponsors the materials, technology, and expertise to make and deliver weapons of mass destruction. We will develop and deploy effective missile defenses to protect America and our allies from sudden attack. And all nations should know America will do what is necessary to ensure our nation's security. We'll be deliberate, yet time is not on our side. I will not wait on events while dangers gather. I will not stand by as peril draws closer and closer. The United States of America will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons.